Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. My name is Tom Ricks, and I will be your host today. This is the fifth in a series of 8 questions that I feel should be asked about the LDS Church. This one is about the church's private land ownership. The title is called, "It Takes a Lot of Men to Make a Gun." Specifically, one of the neat things about being the son of an actress is you get to see a lot of plays that you might not ordinarily have seen. There is a play called Assassins, which is a brilliant musical, which highlights all of the actual assassins of U.S. presidents and also the attempted assassins, and shows how tragic and flawed, and in some cases, most cases, frankly, mentally ill most of these people were. One of them, Zog, the guy you probably never heard of before, the one who assassinated President McKinley, who, ironically, gave us one of the best presidents in the history of the Republic, Teddy Roosevelt, has a song that goes something like this. It takes a lot of men to make a gun, hundreds, many men to make a gun, men in the mines to dig the Huron, men in the mills to forge the steel, men at the machines to turn the barrel, mold the trigger, shape the wheel. It takes a lot of men to make a gun, one gun. Then he, of course, has this delightful duo with John Wilkes Booth, and by delightful I mean morbid and creepy. But that's kind of the whole point of the musical. So my point in the metaphor, or using the lyrics, is that mixing another metaphor, there is an infamous quote by the playwright Checkov, who says that if you put a shotgun over the fireplace in the second act of the play, that if by the final act you have not used that shotgun, you are wasting an opportunity. So, metaphorically speaking, every time I see a shotgun in a movie or a play, I'm expecting somebody to use it. It's a bit like another infamous literary quote called the Bechdel test, where there are a number of women who won't read fiction if they don't have two women in the fiction talking to each other about something other than the men in their lives. What this means to me as far as the LDS Church and why I'm talking about it is because a lot of people are vaguely aware of the rather interesting fact that the LDS Church owns more private land in the United States than just about any other organization. I think, to the best of my knowledge, the only other potential contender for number one private landowner might be McDonald's, and I would be willing to bet at this point that the LDS Church has long exceeded that. At a minimum, they certainly own a ton of land. Just a quick paraphrasing of an article I just looked up on Deseret News. They own $137 million in commercial and industrial properties. They actually own a lot more than that. The fact of the matter is that they own thousands and thousands of acres in many, many states. For example, 13,000 acres in California of agricultural land. In Florida, they have many, many pieces of private undeveloped real estate. They have a 315,000 acre Deseret ranches. And there's also this big controversy in Hawaii right now of a challenge to the church's tax-exempt status because of the Polynesian Cultural Center, which, by the way, is a callback to an earlier episode. I'm sorry, the Polynesian Cultural Center is not doing something special for the children of Manasseh. That's a tourist attraction. Their private real estate holdings, which in Hawaii is a very big deal. But the truth is that you could make the argument that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints could be doing something more with its land holdings than hoarding them, I guess. But, actually, if you know the New Testament, that's one of the very few criticisms of the LDS Church that doesn't hold water. Judas, the apostle, basically criticized Christ for not taking all of the money that he had been given and distributing it to the poor. Christ actually said, that would render unto that which is Caesar's, that unto Caesar, and that which is God unto God. So, a church that accrues a large amount of wealth may be tacky. Christ himself never actually said that his church has to be poor and can't do anything involving wealth to build temples or meeting houses or have huge tracts of land on which to build Swamp Castle. No, the reason that this is a question that should be asked about the LDS Church is why? Now, the money that the LDS Church sinks into its temples all over the world is essentially both a statement of worship and a statement of publicity. Worship, because they do actually genuinely take these things seriously. And even the shallowest, most pathetic among them like to have their pictures taken in front of these buildings because it's a source of pride and status to have an active temple recommend. It's a sense of pride and power and status to be a full tithe payer. And among the actual Christians among them, it's their sacred duty. So there's nothing wrong with putting a lot of money into a building that they believe is worshiping God. And, The more interesting question comes into why do they want large quantities of land, right? So this is a complicated issue, but the LDS Church, like a majority of Christian denominations, believes that there is something called the millennium coming up, which is basically that sooner or later Christ is going to come down from whatever cloud he's floating on and say, you know what? Things are now finally bad enough. I'm going to come down and clean things up. And Christianity, just like all monotheistic Abrahamic religions, is essentially apocalyptic. And that's not meant to be an insult. They all believe this. They all believe in some form of a Messiah who is going to come down and fix the world and in this world and start a new one. In the case of the LDS Church, they believe that there will be 1,000 years of peace, during which they will complete all of the baptism for the dead and all the temple work for all the people that need it, so that the final judgment can take place. And that during this time, the government of Jesus Christ will be in charge. And ironically, among other things, the United States Constitution, which, for the record, I have a problem with, will be the template for the government of Christ on earth. So, there's nothing unique about owning property, and lots of it. The LDS Church just happens to be blessed with an abundance of that. But there's a few things about the LDS Church that make owning all this land the proverbial shotgun on the wall. All Christian churches are, at some level, if they believe in the New Testament and the words of Christ at all, as I said, apocalyptic. But not all of them put as much emphasis on prophecy as the LDS Church. Now, to understand what prophecy is, I would recommend that you go to a dictionary and look it up. But I'm going to save you some time and give you the short version. Prophecy is to say that a specified thing will happen in the future. Well, that's technically the strict definition of prophecy. Theologically, prophecy is a lot more complicated than that. If you really want to understand what the average Christian believes in terms of what prophecy really is, or the LDS Church believes, I highly recommend that you look into the prophecies of Isaiah. Christ himself, in the New Testament, speaks glories about Isaiah, who was probably the most messianic prophet in the Old Testament. Although all of the Old Testament prophets spoke of the coming of the Messiah, none spoke more than Isaiah. So from a Old Testament and New Testament, and to a certain degree even in the Quran perspective, prophecy is not like what you see every January 1st, where you see something like, and now the great Checkov says that this year orange cell phones will be in, right? So a prophecy is a lot more vague. And by vague, I mean kind of like your horoscope is supposed to be vague, but more like it can be applied to a lot of different circumstances. If there was a prophecy that says something along the lines of, in the morning of the great fire, the two men will shake hands and God will smile upon them and the empire will be born, right? So there are certain definitive elements of that statement. There's two men, and then there's an empire that's supposed to be born, and then there's a few things that talk about that day. But the truth is that in a lot of theological circles, that actually can be almost a cyclical prophecy and can be applied to a lot of different occasions. Christ himself actually made a number of prophecies, including that, Jerusalem would eventually be destroyed, that he would eventually return, that he would be resurrected. Whether or not you believe that Christ is God, or that Christ is the Messiah, or that Christ was just simply a very good rabbi, there's no doubting the fact that if you believe even 80% accuracy of the translation and passing of the New Testament, all four of the Gospels of Christ have Christ prophesying. So to understand the LDS Church, you have to understand that Joseph Smith did a lot of prophesying. He made a lot of prophecies. There's a difference in LDS theology between a prophet, seer, and a revelator. A seer is a very specific thing where someone has a seer stone, which is a Urim, something like what was the Urim and Thummim was, where it's essentially a kind of a spiritual focus, almost like a crystal ball that lets you see things past, present, and future and reveals the truth. A revelator is someone who basically, through dint of their office, for whatever office they may have, whether it be large or small, receives revelation from God for the people under their watch. So, for example, when God sent the Ten Commandments to Moses, Moses was acting as a revelator. A prophet is someone who basically says, this is going to happen, and it happens. And traditionally speaking, the indication of prophecy was according to Joseph Smith's own words, an indicator of whether or not they were actually a prophet. Joseph Smith, for example, much like Checkov and the Shotgun in the Second Act, remarkably predicted, i.e. what most people in the entire United States believed, that at some point there would be a civil war, and lo and behold, 20 years after his death, there was, in fact, a civil war. So, prophecy is basically something in the LDS Church that can be cyclical, that must happen, and more importantly, what's different than most religions, with the exception of, for example, a frightening group of evangelicals called the Dominionists, which, just Google it, it's scary enough, believe that prophecy can be helped along. So, one of the prophecies in the LDS Church is that at one point a great famine will hit the land. Now, in the book of Revelations, they talk about, all kinds of bad things happening, and they do mention, among other things, famine. But in LDS theology, it's very specific. Like, there's going to be a famine so bad that one of the LDS prophets had a vision where there were several bars of gold and a cat on his desk. And he picked up the cat because you can eat the cat. Now, that does not mean that you should go around calling Mormons cat gobblers. I have known many members of my family who are cat lovers and who are still very faithful LDS saints. They have no particular desire to eat cats. They don't have cat-flavored ice cream. They don't have cat-flavored popsicles. This is simply a metaphor. In fact, ironically, I would dare say that most Mormons that I know of, and probably most Mormons in general, eating cats is actually abhorrent, which is kind of the whole point of the vision that this particular prophet had. But there is another prophecy that I'm going to go into later called the the white horse prophecy, that involves political action in the United States. And there's a lot of background that you need to understand about that. And the fact that Joseph Smith, for example, at one point ran for president. What you don't need to have a detailed background in to understand is that another thing that members of the LDS Church have is that all of them who receive an endowment, which is basically where they wear the sacred underwear, as people like to make fun of them for it, and which is actually sacred, not silly. They need to make a series of promises or covenants, and I've talked about this a little, but one of the promises that they make is called the law of consecration, where they promise to give all of their time, all of their talents, and everything that they possess to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints if they're asked for it. So that is why, to a faithful saint, it's not just 10% of their net income that they have to give, but if you have a calling and you are given a job in the LDS Church, it does not matter how much time it may take, you will put the church first. You will put the church above your family. You will put the church above your friends. You will put the church above every single thing, if you need to make sure that you do that. Now, on a practical level, of course, there have been all kinds of talks and all kinds of official things about how, you need to balance things and you need to make sure that your family's okay and don't spend so much time on your calling that your family's falling apart. But having said that, make no mistake, in the back of the mind of every faithful LDS saint, they are constantly asking themselves, am I doing enough to help the church? Am I doing enough to help my calling? Guilt is a very common, ubiquitous emotion in most members of the church. Anyway, so I want you to picture the idea that every faithful saint has committed to give everything that they have to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and a firm belief in almost all saints that their actions matter and that they can help prophecy along. And the fact that the LDS Church genuinely believes, to a man, if you are an active saint, they all believe in this prophecy that at some point a famine will come and strike this country. And I want you to understand that the reason Mormons have a year's supply of food is because they believe that sooner or later a famine will come and strike this country. Now, this is what I mean when I'm talking about the shotgun on the wall. So you have a bunch of basically well-meaning Mormons, and then you have the actual leaders of the LDS Church who are very politically ambitious, who are very pro-business. Well, let's just be honest, folks. Right now, we have a president who is essentially a fascist. I'm not going to use the word I want to use, but you've heard it used, and you've heard who he's compared to. And, some of those comparisons are pretty apt. But at minimum, he is definitely the core definition of a fascist. And yet, despite their initial criticism, the civic leaders of the state of Utah, who are almost all universally Mormon, are now suddenly pro-Trump. They might say he's crass because he swears a lot, and because he cheats on his wife, and because he lies and steals and does all kinds of other things that Mormons aren't supposed to do on a regular basis, including sue people. But, he's God's vessel. So when you have a church that is morally flexible enough to basically get behind the guy that's going to get their social agenda most likely passed, and to be clear, the LDS Church, to its credit, has not officially endorsed the current president, but they certainly haven't really spoken out against him. The closest they've come is a very vaguely worded statement that I talked about earlier that kind of vaguely, kind of condemned kids in cages several weeks after the fact with several other churches. So my point is that you have essentially a civic leadership and quietly an ecclesiastical leadership who are at the least morally flexible. You have a gerontocracy where the oldest guy rules. You have a faithful following that is pretty much willing to do whatever their leader commands. And you have a church that believes in a prophecy that there will be a famine sooner or later. You see where I'm going with this? Because if you don't, let me spell it out for you. The shotgun on the wall that is the LDS Church is that for their genuine, and I do actually know for a fact that it is genuine, this is not some conspiracy, this is not some hidden agenda. The LDS Church genuinely believes that this famine is coming and is doing everything they can to prepare for it. The problem is that they have taken zero precautions, except believing in their prophet, to prevent a well-meaning but essentially evil civic leader or high-placed ecclesiastic leader from helping prophecy along by doing something to maybe cause a famine or to basically cause a food shortage. Now, before you criticize me about that, I want you to think about the fact that Donald Trump has, as president, manipulated the stock market by attacking China, by attacking Qatar, by attacking Saudi Arabia, by attacking specific industries. Donald Trump is very aware of the fact that of the 5 quintessential powers that the president has, which is head of state, head of government, chief legislator, commander-in-chief, and international negotiator, that the most, or / leader of the free world, and believe me, head of state is not the same thing as leader of the free world. Of those powers that he has, the most powerful, believe it or not, is head of state. Being the symbol of the country means that he gets a lot of attention, that he has a bully pulpit, and that he can basically single out specific industries and try and cause their stock price to go down. And in certain cases, he's been able to do that. Now, the fact of the matter is that Donald Trump is an idiot, so he's not very successful at it. But I want you to imagine somebody a little bit more intelligent, somebody who might have actually become president, somebody who might have been knowledgeable about something, say, the stock market, who might have been, totally willing to help prophecy along by quietly potentially causing a food shortage to make the LDS Church seem amazing for having all these vast stores of food. Now, I know that sounds cynical, but the fact is that even if it never happens, I want you to think about the fact that nobody in the LDS Church has given a thought to how bad it actually makes them look when you think about it. The fact is that they could actually give all of this land to a third party, a group of people who aren't directly controlled by the church, who have maybe almost half the board made up of non-Mormons, so that if this famine occurs, they are able to help, but it's not directly tied to the LDS Church, so that the LDS Church does not have a direct political and popular gain by appearing to have all this food sitting around. You understand what I'm saying? The fact of the matter is that this is a shotgun on the wall that is basically just sitting there waiting for some powerful Mormon to push things along to help the church. If you know a Mormon, ask them how important their church is to them. And basically, it's everything. So even if 90% of every active Mormon had the ethics to not do this, then just think of the 10% that might. And by the way, that number is not accurate, because most Mormons, most active Mormons, are staunchly Republican. And as we've seen from their ethics in the last year and a half, while they might have the ethics to, have a problem with Donald Trump, that virtue seems to have a length of about 3 months. I can count the number of Mormons I know on one hand who are still actively disgusted by Donald Trump. And none of them are in Utah. So the fact of the matter is, folks, that you have a situation where there's this giant red button that if you are in a position to push it, you have that temptation. The more powerful you are, the more of a chance you might have to push this button to inadvertently cause a famine in one way or another and potentially help the church. Unless, of course, we make the world aware of this prophecy and make the world aware that if there is a famine, the LDS Church might have been behind it. And if they don't want the scrutiny and potential damage that comes from that, then they should not actually be in the business of hoarding large amounts of food. It's one thing for their members to do it, but the church itself should pass that stockpile to somebody else that's not them. Just saying.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, available in many markets, including at Amazon.com. Copyright 2018, Red Anvil Amalgamated, LLC.
To fight the forces of evil!